So in our first video on imperialism, we talked about kind of what the difference between imperialism and colonialism were, what their similarities were, and then we also looked at the motivations and tools that the Europeans would use, or primarily Europeans would use, to expand into imperialistic efforts starting in like the late 1700s, early 1800s. So now what we're going to do is look at specific types of rule that was used by a number of Europeans. So we're going to look at case studies in India, and then also talk about Africa, and then kind of a little bit also within Asia, kind of in the middle there. So within India, it went from company rule from the British East India Company to actual imperial British rule. And so we're going to kind of define what that is and how that exactly happened. So we got our little British East India company logo there. So if you've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean, the second and the third movies, you see kind of that little symbol, the EIC, East India Company, with some of the lion markings that commemorate Great Britain somewhat well. So similar to what the Portuguese had done prior to the arrival of the British and the Dutch in the later 16 and early 1700s, where they began to make their mark, remember it was trading posts that had kind of essentially been what the Europeans had used to establish bases and points to encourage trade and build relationships with the local inhabitants, and when necessary, you do it by force. So the British and Dutch had been competing for what was left over of the Portuguese Empire, and the British came out on top, while the Portuguese would be more into Indonesia and the island of Java. So the British established this with, first within warehouses, and then trading for pepper and cotton, the Chinese silk and porcelain. Remember how this also connects back to the idea of the opium wars and the opium trade that we talked about in chapter 31, and how the British will use that to their advantage. But first, before they went into China, they kind of did their deeds in India to kind of consolidate their hold. So the British East India Company expanded their rule through essentially making unfair treaties. So as the Mughal Empire is going through different types of succession, they're losing territory time and again due to essentially the kind of twisting and turns that the British East India Company is making with other princes to essentially consolidate their hold. So essentially it was kind of like if they don't have a male heir, they have to consolidate or trade up or give the land to the British East India Company. And so kind of over the number of decades, they're able to essentially make, and you can kind of see, areas that are under their control. By 1806, they actually have about half of India kind of coming from, the southeastern half of the subcontinent through kind of the eastern half and a little bit into the northern half, while the Mughal Empire is just kind of slowly losing its control in the northern parts, and then you have other princely tribute states and princes that have kind of small principalities throughout the other parts of the subcontinent. All right. And part of this is, again, the fact that when they go into conflict with one another, the British East India Company is supplying weapons to certain sides. So they see initial short-term benefits, but don't see the long-term negative results that comes from this. And again, much of India does not necessarily come together because there's no sense of Indian nationalism. It's been, certain regions, and you'd have certain, maybe religious differences. But again, it's no sense of no Indian nationalism, no Indian people. It's, regions of the subcontinent that have been conquered and ruled by different dynasties, different empires over the centuries. So this is also going to be similar to kind of what the Dutch are using in Indonesia and Java to essentially establish and then create more and more control. So in the 1850s, however, what leads to the end of colonial company rule, and then we'll shift over to imperial rule, is a rebellion in 1857 and 1858, led initially by the sepoys, who are Indian troops that are fighting for the British East India Company, and they're essentially hired soldiers trained in to fight for the company. Think about your own little private army. Hence why when you see, Pirates of the Caribbean, it makes sense that the British East India Company or Dutch East India Company has private military forces, because they did. But anyway, so while the Indian forces make up the majority of a lot of the British East India Company's forces, a lot of it comes down to the fact that, or why they begin to rebel, is because of in the book, I found really intriguing, that the book mentioned, and all the other sources do too, that the grease that they used for their muskets and for their weapons, you had to, chomp at it and, put that in for the powder or the cartridge, and it was, pig and cow grease, which, Muslims, with reverence for cows, did not like that. Hindus with a reverence for cows did not like that. The Muslims who think of pigs as filthy animals found it abhorrent. So neither side was a fan of that and felt like they were being, messed around with by the British East India Company, trying converting them to Christianity, trying to make fun of them, and add in that with the discontent from local princes and people who have been, kind of losing authority, losing money to the East India Company, said, yeah, now's the time to rebel, and it starts. They are defeated by loyal sepoys, many of them from the Punjab region, kind of up here, who are Sikhs, which are not Muslim or not Muslim, not Christian, not Hindus. But that's one group that stops, and then also the British Army does come as the British Navy to put down said rebellion. And so that leads to the British government saying, okay, East India Company, you had your chance. You made us a lot of wealth, but you messed us up pretty bad, and we're not going to lose this big investment in terms of one of our massive colonies, a part of the empire. So that's what leads to the British government now taking control of India in some way, whether that's direct control or making tribute states out of what's left of those principalities. So what they do is they figure out a way to essentially consolidate their power by focusing the Indian crop production on certain trade items. So again, focusing on where's the British government going to make the most money, or the British company is going to make the most money. So they cut down a lot of the forests on the interior of the subcontinent in terms of growing, again, opium, growing coffee, growing tea. They do the same thing in Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka down here. They, at the same time, building again of railroad lines, telegraph lines, irrigation systems, all essentially increasing harbors and canals, all again back to how does this produce more for the British Empire to make more money? And then they will start imposing, British culture in a sense with creation of schools that teach the English language, English values, and support throughout the empire. So you can also see, kind of back actually to the image of the East India Company here, forcing British or Hindu or Indian princes to sign here. I forgot to mention that before. So here we have British acquisition that was owned by the British government and the British East India Company, and then dependent Indian states, what was left of it. Okay, so you can't see that. And then here's the railroads. These were proposed railroad lines in the black. I don't know if the other one for the black lines were actually open railroads. It looks like it was, so you can kind of see how that consolidates power throughout a very massive, large amount of land. All right. So not only is Great Britain getting in on this, but also in Asia we have the Great Game, which is between Great Britain and also Russia for the interior, predominantly fighting over Afghanistan. So you have to remember this is the same time period where Russia is expanding into Central Asia. So adding in this territory in the green, and then areas of northern Afghanistan would now be like Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, areas of that nature, kind of right over here, kind of in that same time. So kind of fighting between those two. Hence why we get this little image here of the Great Game, save me from my friends, because they're both trying to influence the territory as they're expanding along what was left of the Silk Road. We're still used again for the interior trading on that. Okay. So at the same time, we also know that imperialism is occurring throughout much of Asia. At the same time where, the Opium Wars are enforcing extraterritoriality treaties on China, we have the Dutch down here, pretty much in Indonesia, and they'll essentially keep hold of that up until World War II. You have French Indochina throughout here, which is, again, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which the French will predominantly hold on to, again, up until World War II, and then they'll reclaim it, and then that'll, spark the Vietnam War. And so, we can kind of think about what are the resources here that they really want to be controlling, and how will that connect itself to when they are able to do it later on, create their spheres of influence within China. It borders a lot of those territories that they had hold of for their colonies. All right. So then the last one to really talk about here in terms of controlling is Africa. So again, here's kind of our world empire map in the year 1800. So you kind of see again the Ottomans here, and you get a little bit of Europeans again on the outskirts relating more towards the slave trade. So you can kind of see Britain kind of down here in the bottom of Nigeria and Togo and Benin. You have the Dutch down here in South Africa. You have Portugal here along the Congo and Angola, and then a little bit down here in Mozambique. So how do we go from this, where they're barely on the outside of kind of on the outskirts, on the borders, on the harbors and coasts of Africa to, by 1914, 114-year shift, all of a sudden now it's all been essentially, smushed together and now is considered under flags of almost all different British lands. All right, so now Germany has gotten involved there. We see Italy has gotten involved as well. Belgium has taken the Congo. What's happened? Well, we discover, or I should say we, the Europeans discover what's really on the interior of Africa. And again, you see some things like uranium. That wasn't the big thing back then. But you have bauxite, you have copper, coal, diamonds. So you can think about what was really important. Oil, kind of in the later parts of the 1800s, becoming more and more important. So again, this is kind of setting up the connection back to the Industrial Revolution and getting access for natural resources to then make more stuff and then also markets to sell to. Okay, so that becomes what's known as the scramble for Africa that gets resolved with the Berlin Conference. So you can kind of see, kind of what we saw in Chapter 31, where the Europeans were pretty much cutting up China through spheres of influence. Now it's not spheres of influence. Now it's actual colonies to be administered by the Europeans. So the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885 sets the rules for Europe to sort of what it means to claim the territory, how do you divide it, and how do we settle lands within Africa. So it says, you have to essentially, send in people and prove that you own it either through treaties with, local chiefs or tribes, and you have to make that claim and to make it a valuable claim before other Europeans can. For them, this was a reason to avoid war while pushing for militarism, nationalism, and imperialism, and also the Industrial Revolution. So you have those connections there. So they also would, at the conference, essentially justify it through the idea of, again, civilizing these people through pushing for Christianity, European values, ending the slave trade in their mind, and also, again, expand their markets. And would use military force. Remember, we kind of talked about in the last video what advantages they have to establish these colonies, and often disregarding tribal and ethnic boundaries within Africa. Hence why I have these two maps here. Okay, you can kind of see all the different ethnic groups and tribal groups that were in existence before, now being divided and split up between the Europeans without really a care in the world. And that will have long-lasting conflicts and implications based on, who is where and why they do it. And the only ones that will remain independent will be Ethiopia and Liberia. So we will come back to that in the next video. But one other thing to point out is not just that Europe is the only ones getting involved here. Okay, we know Japan from the last video is getting involved too, but so is the United States. So if you took regular U.S. history last year, we didn't really talk about it. You take AP U.S. history, that's a big moment. Okay, because you can I love the SpongeBob meme. I'm not even a big fan of SpongeBob. I didn't grow up with it, but it's great. You like imperialisms, don't you, America? Because you can see Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, things taken away from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War, essentially turned into American colonies. And then also at the same time where you have those Guano Islands too. And that connects us back a little bit to the Monroe Doctrine of we're going to protect the Americas from outside interference as long as it's, no Europeans interfering. So, and then the next video we'll start talking about how they actually rule these territories. So we talked about that with India. But now we'll expand on it more predominantly in Africa. What does that rule actually look like, and the effects and legacies and the outcomes of the European imperialist rules and organizations.